Hi, good day. My name's Dr. Tabo Huntley. I'm from John Moores University in Liverpool, and I've been working in this disability sport space for over 20 years as a coach, as a researcher, and also in the context of actually setting up a elite sports system in the Middle East. So I'm very much acquainted with this particular space. And I guess because of that, I've been invited to share this keynote. So thank you for the time. Thank you for the invitation. It's a privilege to be here and to present the findings of some work that we've been doing. So without further ado, in terms of the presentation today, I'm going to just do a brief introduction, give you a snapshot of our methodological considerations, introduce the kind of synthesizing framework, how we made sense of this data, before presenting the kind of the findings and discussion. And then hopefully we'll have time for discussion and questions. But in essence, this presentation is based on this particular paper we published last year, based on the Erasmus Plus Paracoach project with 5 other countries and institutions. And I'm thankful to my colleagues who have supported that project and also helped pull together this paper. So in essence, as we started to think about the project and how we understand the coaching workforce, we wanted to provide like a contextual background here. And that is, we know that disabled people are probably one of the most excluded groups from sport and physical activity and within society. And to counteract that, we have EU policies, UN policies, you've probably got your own national policies that aims to reverse this particular type of trend. And whilst you have that kind of policy aimed at more for an inclusive society, we also have the EU kind of agenda around coaching, which actually recognizes coaching and the coaching workforce as key conduits in supporting not only performance agendas, but social agendas as well, such as the inclusion of disabled people in sport. But what we do have, despite that recognition, is that coaching research, paracoaching research, continually shows that coaches operate in an environment that lacks recognition, lacks coach education, lacks learning support and CPD opportunities. So when we highlight the fact that coaches and sport coaching are key providers of sporting experiences for disabled people, then their problem is, so why aren't they supported so much? Why are we continually hearing the same things within research? A lack of coach education, a lack of support. So this is, for me, has been kind of my drive over, I don't know, 10, 13 years now, is around helping the coaching workforce within parasport get the recognition it deserves, but also advocate for more support. So in order to do that, we took a survey in which we had 275 completed responses from coaches representing 18 countries across 54 distinctive sports, quite a wide variety of sports. We utilized a convergent mixed method approach, which combined quant statistic analysis alongside thematic analysis to offer kind of the breadth, but a little bit of depth, bearing in mind it's a survey. And we wanted to kind of look at the notion of professional legitimacy and the status of the para coaching in line with what maybe theory says. which then brought us to this theory of professions, which was sociological in nature, and also Thomas's sociological relational model of disability. So that was our kind of methodological overview, which I'll go into a little bit more in depth right now. And so for us, as we look through the data, we were seeing that there were different types of trends, whether it was in elite performance, whether it was in recreational sport. There were differences in terms of the number of hours, the types of education, the support networks. We were seeing all this data, which was great. And so we started to think about, okay, what does this mean for a professional identity? And then we came across Abbott's work, which is sociological in nature, and which means that professions kind of develop over time. There's a certain kind of temporal nature to these. And as its core of a profession was the notion that professions tend to solve a problem within society. And in this case, the step one, the diagnosis is, okay, how do we solve the problem of disabled people being excluded in sport and society? Once we have that kind of question and you kind of identify that problem, the next step is then to think, okay, what kind of knowledge do we need in order to overcome that diagnosis? And you have this interference. And then once you've got the diagnosis, you've got the interference, okay, how then do we actually deliver what is needed? In this case, how do we deliver inclusive and empowering practices that solves the problem of exclusion? So this was the fundamental thing. It wasn't, we didn't want to go straight to say, right, well, you in order to be a profession, you need all of these categories to be ticked. We wanted to come at it from a more relational perspective to see how do we fit within the broader understanding of a sociology of professions. So we felt that Abbott's work was helpful, and in particularly the notion that professions compete implicitly, sometimes explicitly, for a claim over a distinct domain of practice. So the medical profession has a distinct claim over a particular distinct domain of practice, the medical field, the teaching field. Okay, so there's some commonalities that have helped, or that Abbott alludes to in terms of the ability to legitimize claim. So the medical profession has demonstrated legitimate claim. It's now in law. So you cannot be a GP or a medical professional unless you have these basic competencies enshrined in law. Okay, so that's the ultimate legitimate claim. Okay. So alongside that, we also thought, well, hang on a minute, this is disability. And we know in research, from disability research, we know that we have the medical model, which defines disability or limits disability to a problem with the individual. Social model that looks at the issue of disability being a systems approach or societal problem. But we felt that the social relational model by Carol Thomas was really important here in sport, particularly at layer one, because we need to understand the biological function. So we know that whether you've got a visual impairment or whether you've got a spinal cord injury or whether you've got intellectual impairment, there is an alteration at the level of the biological function or cognitive function. And then at the second layer, in terms of the social, environmental, societal structures, we do have facilities that are based on ableist norms and practices, cultures. And so when you have a change to biological function, placing that within the context of an ableist society, you're going to have a disconnect between the two. And this is where Carol Thomas's notion of impairment effect is really helpful, because we can start to think about in what ways do different disabled people experience in different disabled practices in different contexts. Okay? That's a mouthful. Well done to Hannes in trying to get that through the translation. But essentially, this is a complex. So disability is a complex social relational matter, and we felt that was important. So in combining those two frameworks, we can start to think about, okay, how do we claim legitimacy? How do we include disabled people? How do we dismantle exclusionary structures and practices? And ultimately, from a coach's perspective, we need to think then about what coaches' knowledge, their experience, their education, their roles and practice, how are they all mediated by social, cultural, and economic factors? So it's not saying that coaches in themselves are the problem. What we're saying is that the barriers that coaches experience, the barriers that athletes experience in sport, are mediated by much wider social cultural factors. And we'll go into some of those findings right now. So the first finding that we identified was the fact that less than 1% of the paracoach population were disabled. There was a gender bias in terms of there were 76% of those who completed that question was 76 were male, and across all domains there was 73%. So basically we're having a male-dominated paracoach workforce. In terms of financial support, 56% of the coaches across all domains were paid below the national average, which suggests that obviously it doesn't have a high standing. And then there's what we then also identified was that there was a split in terms of the impact of domains on the characteristics of the workforce. So in the elite domain, you had more master coaches. They were delivering more hours. They were typically employed within sport governing bodies. And they were also had prior able-bodied international athlete experience. So in other words, to become a coach in the elite domain, it seems like you had to have had prior able-bodied international athlete experience. Whereas in the recreation domain, the majority of those coaches were volunteers. They only did maybe 1 to 5 hours a week, who were typically based in local clubs, and their prior experience was in the recreational domain. So you didn't get any recreational athletes that were coaching in elite sport. Okay, so we're starting to get this feel that there's certain trends that defines the workforce. Now, when we think of the workforce in itself, this kind of laminated picture can provide a status ambiguity. So basically, can you compare an elite coach with a recreational coach? So there's a difference there, isn't there? But also, because we have more males, we've got no disabled people within the workforce. When we're thinking about solving the problem of exclusion, well, this workforce is actually quite exclusionary in terms of the types of people who are in this particular positions of coaching. And so together, there's kind of ambiguity. We're not really solving the problem of exclusion. We're actually promoting this notion of exclusion implicitly, just because of the system that is sport. There's an education in the void. So that was the key finding in terms of 48% of coaches in the recreational domain had no coaching qualifications. So when we think about a body of knowledge, the medical field has a body of knowledge. It has a body that oversees the quality assurance. In this, on our findings, we have coaches that are coaching without any form of coaching qualification. Moreover, over 56% of the coaches said that there were no para-sport specific qualifications or standards, or at least they didn't even know about them. Okay, and only 55% of coaches said that their formal coach education, the formal coach education has a moderate to no impact on the delivery of coaching. So there's a disconnect between the educational need and what it should be and the reality of that. And when we think of Abbott's work, actually a professional body of knowledge gained through certified educational institutions is considered the foundation for legitimate status. So it's very difficult to start thinking about professionalization when we have this disconnect. Educational systems also should provide a formal pathway towards expertise or master coach. And in this case, we found a broken pathway. And actually, the informal pathway or the dominant pathway was you're an able-bodied athlete, you then step into coaching, and you fast track towards elite master coach. So relying on able-bodied athletic experiences as the foundation for competence just reinforces exclusionary norms. It basically locks disabled individuals and others, such as females, out of coaching roles. So it's not, that's the issue, that's the problem, that social norms drives the pathway as opposed to coach education driving the pathway. This, without coach education, without any kind of really official support systems, then we have also now a breakdown in the support of CPD access. So 6 to 7% of the workforce do not access mentoring or CPD. Okay, and that's probably the take-home message. So not only do we have ineffective coach education, but we also have a lack of wider support, whether it's mentoring or CPD, which again, taken together, reflects the kind of impoverished nature of disability sport. When we then start to think about the types of knowledge coaches need or in order to support athletes, there's again a difference between the domains. In the performance domain, the athletes typically were cerebral palsy, or they needed knowledge about cerebral palsy or impaired in power. These particular athletes didn't require any additional assistance, which then means that in the performance domain, arguably the athletes that coaches work with are more able. And the knowledge deficit in terms of what coaches needed were very much based on either medical or performance outcomes. So they want about physiology, they want about psychology, they want about medical support. So that's that's the type of knowledge that I guess defines the coach within performance, whereas in the recreation, it's more leaned towards intellectual impairments, the need for accessible transportation, and kind of more of a holistic care for their athletes. So there's again, the domains influence what knowledge coaches feel that they need to grasp. Similarly, in terms of when we asked coaches about where do they go to for impairment-related knowledge, again, it was about focuses on the outcomes, so performance outcomes. So they go to more experienced coaches, they go to sports science and medical practitioners, disability experts, athletes and carers, again, in the absence of coach education. So professional knowledge is primarily gained from informal, heavily medicalized networks, which, when we start to think about claims to jurisdiction, if coaches need knowledge from other established disciplines, then this becomes the challenge for us to start thinking about, actually, do coaches have legitimacy in terms of claiming knowledge from other disciplines within sport? Again, that's some of that complexity. The impairment effect, the nature of the athlete's impairment impacted or informs the professional knowledge. In this case, it added to the need for understanding around assistive technology, classification, accessible transportation, accommodation, things that you might have experienced yourselves, modified vehicles, lifts, etc. So the coach becomes this like logistics expert, which is more a more wider remit than someone who's coaching able-bodied sport. So you're working with, and particularly in my experience, working with global athletes, you need to think about guide dogs, for example. So my view and the take here through our analysis is that coaches are basically taking in like highly technical insights from different professions, health professions, disability experts, and science, and they're basically taking all this through, synthesizing that, and then trying to, where best they can, provide effective coaching. So for me, the para coach has a wider remit, a much wider remit, a knowledge base than those operating in non-disabled sport. So here we enter this quasi-professional paradox, where in the absence of educational void, we go towards kind of able-bodied norms and practices as the proxy for coaching competence, which then reinforces exclusionary workforce profiles, which are typically male-dominated and are drawing from medicalized networks. And that then leads to this jurisdictional failure, because in against that backdrop, how can we say that we're solving the problem of inclusion or exclusion by developing a representative workforce? It's a bit of a paradox, if that makes sense. So in terms of expanding the boundaries of knowledge, I would argue that coaching, para coaching, requires a much broader depth of knowledge based on the impairment effect, like secondary medical conditions we've not discussed, the understanding of how disability is understood culturally. They have to negotiate highly complex, informal, ad hoc, multidisciplinary networks. So it's based on the coach having to go and find information as opposed to it being readily available. When we think of equipment, if you've worked in this particular space, we know that equipment needs to be personalized, which means as soon as it's personalized, it means it becomes more expensive. There's a typical lack of coach education, support, and development pathway compared to mainstream coaching. And then we have standardized models in mainstream coaching that are typically pulled into para coaching, but then para coaching requires further knowledge around rehabilitation. So someone who has had a road traffic accident goes through a period of rehabilitation, then has to be integrated into sport. Do coaches need to understand that? Do the coaches need to understand more about empowering athletes to overcome some of the practices and situations that they find themselves in on a daily basis? So again, an athlete coming to your training session may have had one of the worst journeys by train or by car because the lack of accessible transportation. So they come to your training session already probably have 40% of their energy trying to overcome barriers to then come to your session, and then it's almost like, right, I've only got this amount of energy left. So do coaches need to then become advocates for the removal of barriers. I would suggest so. So we need to understand their athletes. So I think we have a much wider complex jurisdictional claim. It's there. The coaches are operated in this space. We're acknowledging that. The question is, how do we help the coaching workforce step into that, or how do we help the coaching workforce become more legitimized in the eyes of those who hold power? And for me, the important thing, we need to break the stranglehold of the medical model, which basically places medical model assumptions on disabled people, views disability, sport, physical activity as something that is lesser in value and compared to able-bodied models. And for us, it's really important that we break that by introducing the social relational model, which focuses on the impairment. So every impairment is different. The impact of the impairment on function is different. The context of where people move is very different. And so we need a system, a coach education system, more broadly, that understands how different disabled people experience different exclusionary practices in different contexts. It's not about fixing the athlete, it's about fixing the system. And we've taken a step in terms of publishing this particular paper, infusing disability into coach education and development, a critical review and agenda for change. And we did that to bridge the void, to try and help formalize the profession in terms of integrating the essence of the social relational model across coach education, to acknowledge that we do need to have coach education that disability is integrated, whether it's introduction to level 4 or the highest level, disability is always integrated throughout. And to basically break that ableist trial and error that just perpetuates in informal networks, which again, we need to also ensure that we have a informal network or a formal CPD and mentoring network that's funded, that's structured in a way that also helps us to challenge ableist practices. And I think also along to support that, we also need to have some form of inclusive licensing, where we actively license disabled and female coaches. We actually, we ask sport governing bodies, how many of these groups have you got? Are they on decision-making boards? Are they involved in the development of coach education? Those are the things that we're advocating for. So in essence, we think the blueprint for professionalization or greater professionalization is aimed at policymakers and governing bodies to have representative targets for disabled people and female coaches. We advocate for coaching licenses to directly verify para-specific qualifications, not just the pass. So in order to master coach, you need to have gone through a formal coach education system and qualification, not just go, okay, you've been an athlete, you can just be fast-tracked. That doesn't help at all. Coach educators, we need to have a social relational model integrated across all curricula for coach educators, coach developers, so they understand when they're supporting coaches and their athletes that they're not perpetuating ableist thinking. We need to make sure that the networks are open to all, especially in the recreational domain. That's a real important aspect of our focus. And then in terms of the level of academics and leadership, we need to think about a cultural change in terms of how we dismantle ableism, and how do we fast-track disabled athletes into leadership positions across the board, not just in coaching. And obviously, alongside that, we need to think about long-term research evaluation to ensure that we are actually making that there's transformation taking place, not just tick boxes in terms of very simple evaluation templates. We need to think about a deep dive in terms of, what impact are we having and what's the reason for that impact, and where there's no impact, what are those reasons, and highlighting those and calling those out. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for listening to me remotely here via this video. The question I have is, should we be advocating for coaching to be professional? Should we be focusing on the professionalization of coaches or them becoming more professional in their approach? What's your thoughts? It's now over to you. So thank you. I'm here to take any questions.